Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm entirely delighted to welcome Jeffrey Augustine back to the show. Hi, Jeff. How you doing?
Great, John. How are you? Good to be back.
I'm extraordinarily well, actually.
Good. So, you're looking well. The picture of radiant health.
I am a picture of radiant health. It's so true. Cool. So we are today going to talk about the electropsychometer.
Yes.
And, I too did a fair amount of work into this. You know that Jung used one of these things in the 1920s, a Wheatstone break.
Yes. Yeah. We'll get to that.
And they're being sold in Practical Mechanics, you know, how to build your own in the 1940s. And then Volney Matthison came along. So give us your introduction to this topic and we shall go from there.
Well, it begins with electricity. And, we've all heard stories in school growing up about Benjamin Franklin flying a kite into a storm.
Go fly, Franklin.
Yes, Ben Franklin. People didn't know what electricity was. They knew something existed, but they didn't know what it was. So as a practical matter, when electricity became known about, it was like aspirin. You know, it took 100 years to really figure out what aspirin was and did, how it exactly worked. They didn't work. So the early work in electricity and among scientists was to measure it. How do you even measure electricity? So the mathematics came about of amperage, ohms, volts.
Yeah.
They also had to build practical equipment to find out like what would conduct electricity, how would it flow? Like water in a hose, well, you needed wire. So they found out that copper was a good conductor. Wood wasn't. They found out they could insulate it. And then when you were going to devise what's called a circuit to make electricity do something. So you see, you had to get resistance. So you wanted more or less electricity. You'd put in a resistor. And so you had to build the basic equipment. And one of the most important parts of the equipment was how to measure it, how to measure current in terms of voltage, amperage, force, resistance. So they built early meters to measure electricity. Okay, so that was a French scientist named Jacques de Varsenal invented the galvanometer, and that's what it was called. And that was sort of named in honor of a scientist named Luigi Galvani. And he performed a very famous experiment in 1786. Do you know what he did?
He was it a monkey he used, but he put electricity, or is it a frog, the first one? He put electricity in and it twitches as if it's alive.
Now, we take this as, this was a big deal back in 1786. What Galvani did, nobody knew what animated life forms, living creatures. And there were theories that, the Holy Spirit animated it all, or there was humors, there were different things. So Luigi did a big experiment, and Luigi Galvani did a big experiment where scientists were watching, and they were dissecting a frog. And he took a battery and he applied current to the leg of the dissected frog. It was dead, and the leg twitched. And that proved that the nervous system of animals was electrical in nature. This was a big, big breakthrough. It was quite an affront to religion, because religion believes that only the Holy Spirit animated life. It was not electricity. So coincident with, Darwin's theory of evolution, it began to shake the world. But this experiment was very interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, the British Navy took an interest in it because they thought that perhaps electricity could be revived, could be used to revive sailors who had drowned at sea. And that could bring them back. Scientists of that period took several criminals who had just been executed, hung by the neck till dead. And they found out by putting electricity into the dead body, the body would jerk and animate. So there was some view that you could perhaps accomplish electrical resurrection of the dead.
And we get, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster.
Exactly. She was conversant with Galvani's work, and this whole conversation that gripped America, Europe, not just scientific circles, but literary circles. Because writers will take, as we know, writers will take technology and create things like Star Trek. So Frankenstein came out of Galvani's experiment that you could assemble a man from deceased parts and bring him to life through electricity, through this marvelous unknown force.
And what happens later, you can see in Gene Wilder's portrayal of Frankenstein in the Mel Brooks film, and it all went badly wrong.
It went utterly wrong.
Yeah.
So now, here's the other thing that happens with technology. Not only do you get the literati, the intellectuals talking about the latest technology, you get the con artists. They're going to come along. And
and galvanism becomes a whole subject, doesn't it?
Well, we have a charlatan emerge, of course, named Franz Mesmer. Now, he lived from 1734 to 1815. And Mesmer is a very interesting prototype, or he prefigures L. Ron Hubbard, one of our later subjects of interest in this podcast. So Franz Mesmer, the term, when Galvani, proved through the frog experiment that electricity animated the nervous system of mammals, Mesmer called it animal electricity or animal magnetism. That came into view. And so Mesmer created a theory that the reason you were unhealthy or sick is you had imbalances in the animal magnetism, the flows of your body. So he created a treatment in these very expensive salons for the upper class of Europe, where he would use his eyes and his hands to adjust the flows of your body, to get your animal magnetism back into correct function, and then your maladies would disappear.
And he also had the tub with the rods in it that people could hold on to, and and of course that brings us back to Benjamin Franklin, who was on the French commission that basically said that animal magnetism was a nonsense. They also pushed hypnosis aside at that time.
It's interesting that Benjamin Franklin was the American ambassador to France.
Yeah.
So King Louis XVI appointed a royal commission that included Benjamin Franklin to investigate this. Yeah. And Benjamin Franklin, what's interesting in my notes here, I have a 92-page write-up on my blog called The History of the Emeter. I think it's one of the best pieces out there. You can go to the header of ScientologyMoneyProject.com. It'll see the history of the emeter. It's a 10-part. And what's interesting on this committee that King Louis XVI appointed was the Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine. Although he didn't invent the guillotine.
His Englishman invented the guillotine.
I know, but he recommended it it came to bear his name. In one of those odd historical coincidences, King Louis XVI had Dr. Guillotine later lost his own head to the guillotine. Who knew? You have it named after you, then
maybe karma does sometimes work.
Well, Marie Antoinette, she would know all about that. Let them eat cake. Let them join the IAS. But what's interesting, this Mesmerism Commission, looking into what we'd call pseudoscience, junk science, they had only one dissenting vote. It was a closed vote whether mesmerism was a real thing back then. And they claimed, the commission ultimately found that it was just the result of the imagination of the person. This gets real important, John, the imagination of the person.
Yeah, guided imagination is one of the definitions of hypnosis.
Yes. And I made you say that by adjusting.
Incredible, wasn't that? Yeah.
The mesmeric flows. Okay, to the internet.
Electrical flows.
So Even though they didn't understand the human nervous system altogether, they knew that it was electrical in nature. So that's the first part of the history of the e-meter.
Yes.
And this will get too important. So they began to develop for industrial applications, the materials, the measuring devices, and the galvanometer moved. It was sort of if you took a ruler and bent it at 180, it was just a dial and it had a needle that deflected.
Oh.
That's the basic form of the analog meter. It was invented in France, and so that dial became important because you could measure different things with a dial. So that we needed a way to represent something in nature in a mathematical, physical way.
Yeah.
So you basically took a ruler and bent it 180, and you could dial it, and you could measure different things. You could calibrate it to measure different values, whether it was liquid, water, air, electricity, pressure. So this meter became a science known as metrology, the science of measurement.
Yeah.
And this was an important part of science. So the human nervous system is electrical. Then we have the science of metrology, of how to measure things. And these are going to come together. And Hermann von Helmholtz, he lived from 1821 to 1894. He's the father of what's called electrophysiology. He's the first one who started to measure the human nervous system as it is electrical. For example, his early work gave rise to what's called the EKG, electrocardiogram. Von Helmholtz realized by putting probes on the human skin, the chest, he could measure heart rhythm. Yep. And that was a major breakthrough in medical science. To measure, the EKG was the first true medical device that could measure the electrical rhythm of the heart. And that was not trivial. It was a major medical breakthrough because they could tell if your heart wasn't, they could measure a healthy heart to see the rhythm. And then a diseased heart would give a different readout. Yeah. And they had the stylus to print this out on paper. So they could tell if you had heart disease. And this is interesting because alongside genuine life-saving and diagnostic medical technology, scientific instrumentation, you have charlatanism, fraud, pseudoscience, quackery. These things go in together. And in the popular magazines of the day, serious science writers would get it right and fabulous would get it wrong.
Yes.
And then, of course, people looking to make money would build devices, they claim could do things. So an interesting thing was they measured the speed of nerve impulses in humans. How fast does thought travel? That was an interesting development as well, because our reaction time when we drive a car, how long does it take you to hit, when a collision is impending, how long does it take you to hit the brake? Well, what they found is in these early researches, as anyone of us knows who's had a panic stop, your body will react before your conscious mind does. And that's interesting because you have vision, brain, seeing, nervous system all wired together in a sort of a pre-conscious manner. You're hitting the brake before you don't have to consciously form the thought that I need to hit the brake. So they were looking at
returning a tennis ball that you're using the limbic system, the old brain, before we can't think fast enough to actually hit a tennis ball that's coming at us at 100 miles an hour. So there's a whole part of our behavior that is, let's say, reactive, but it's not what Hubbard defined as reactive.
No, but that's very important because heart rate, digestion, breathing, that's all automatic. That's part of the
autonomic system.
Yes, the autonomic nervous system that works without us thinking. Because if you had to think, I have to breathe, I have to breathe, I have to beat my heart, you would die. You just couldn't do it. So a lot of what they realized, a lot of the body is automated by the brain. And that automaticity is preconscious, and you don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
So this led Freud to think about there's an unconscious part of the psyche that's not accessible. It's unconscious.
Well, to be fair, the notion of the unconscious mind predates Freud by about 40 years. And he got it wrong. Pierre Janet, who studied with him at the Salpêtrière under Charcot, got it right. And the contemporary view of the unconscious is not Freudian, of course. Just hate Freud, have to say something nasty about him every chance I get. So I just put that in.
Well, let's just, to be fair, and you are correct, but to be fair, Freud popularized the notion of the unconscious, albeit imperfectly.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that it does become the idea of an internal agent that is capable of action against you, which is religion had already got and which Scientology would use, and no such thing exists. There are unconscious processes, and the consciousness can actually explore most of them, but we're getting into deep water here.
Well, no, it's interesting, and we'll get into that later about models and constructs.
Yeah.
And how people like Freud or Hubbard can use models or constructs, and they can develop a pseudoscience around them.
Yeah, which is
So
kind of an extension of metaphors, that the metaphor becomes absolute. You have a held down 7 in your mind, and therefore all calculations are wrong. And we then extend that metaphor further. And the point is that metaphor didn't work in the first place. The human mind is not a calculator. Hubbard got lucky because the word computer was still being used to mean an adding machine when he used it in 1950. But
yeah, and we're getting ahead of it. I want to get back to just Helmholtz for a minute.
Please, yeah.
He wanted to measure the speed of thought, and he had an apparatus set up to measure it, but he found that the speed of nerve transmission or thought was not uniform in all people. For example, people who were distracted or not feeling good, or who were scared or intimidated by the science of it, the speed would vary, the reaction would vary. And he noticed that the psychological state of a person being experimented upon would affect the speed of what he was measuring as thought, right? With his imperfect instruments. And one commentator says at this point, Helmholtz had definitely reached psychological ground. And so Helmholtz is the first one to take the galvanometer, which is what it was called before. We'll get to why it was called the electropsychometer. He took it into psychological territory. He noticed in measurements, psychological state affected speed of thought, which is very interesting. And it's uncertain at that point if correlation implied causation.
Yes.
That's a very important thing. Now, the big breakthrough with Helmholtz and electrophysiology, they observed decreases in skin resistance in response to stresses, distractions, other things like that. Said another way, the skin is electrically active. That's what we're getting to get to the emeter, is galvanic skin resistance. The electrical nature of the skin changes in response to psychological states. In every person, everyone who's alive or who's ever lived has a heart, lungs, brain, eyes, right? We also have galvanic skin resistance. Everyone has it, and it changes in response to stressors. So it doesn't matter whether you're Hindu, Christian, Jew, atheist, Muslim, Buddhist, nobody, you're going to have galvanic skin resistance, just like you have heart, breath, and respiration. So there's a pre-existing physiological substrate called galvanic skin resistance. And the early experimenters noticed that it changed in response to your mood. If you're scared, nervous, your palms could get sweaty. And most of the glands that this happens in are in the hands and the feet. That's where you have most of those particular type of, I think they're called epicene glands. And so measuring galvanic skin resistance is part of electrophysiology. And there was a Charles Ferrer, 1852-1907. He basically found that by using a piece of lab equipment to measure electricity by putting it on the human body, he could measure changes in galvanic skin resistance. So that's what he was noticing. Where does this go to? They've taken scientific lab equipment and applied it to psychological states. So the natural jump is somebody at some point created a lie detector. They said, you know what, if we can use this device, and that's generally one of the contenders for who invented the lie detector was Wilhelm Einthoven. He was working with the electrocardiogram, and he ventured off into something you could call lie detection. He would notice that. And then there was a researcher, John D. Tarkanoff. He created a paper called Galvanic Phenomena in the Human Skin in Connection with Irritation of the Sensory Organs and Various Forms of Psychic Activity. That was in those days when they had long titles for scientific papers. Galvanic Phenomena in the Human Skin in Connection with Irritation of the Sensory Organs and Various Forms of Psychic Activity. So that was done in 1890. Basically, they jump it to a lie detector in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And the police are really interested because rather than interrogating a suspect and beating out of him with a rolled up phone book, they had this device, that you would hold, and they would ask you, did you rob the bank? No. And then the needle would deflect. They knew you were lying, or they claimed that they knew you were lying. But let's go back a little bit of a ways to Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Now, he produced he did voluminous research and with a galvanometer. It was not the emeter yet. It was a galvanometer. He did voluminous work, and there's a book of almost 600 pages on his work. And he was doing what we would call word association or trigger words. And he did quite a bit of work. So they would use words: ghost, injury, accident, childhood, mother, father, and they would see how it read. Now, his equipment at that time was not that good, but he was doing what Hubbard would later call word association. Comments on that?
Yeah. I mean, Jung is somebody else that I say nasty things about. Let's get this right way around.
Sure.
He's a dreadful human being, but obsessively driven. And so he does bring, he's certainly more scientific in his approach than Freud. Freud tended to just pick up things from conversations and then relay them as great truths that he'd discovered. So, for example, the term talking cure, which he picked up from somebody else. Jung was studious in that way, but he's morally flawed. I mean, his promiscuous relationships with his patients are certainly something that would not be permitted in these days. But yeah, he's trying to find a path through this, and it is relevant at that time. The idea, we now look at the lie detector and sort of say, well, it's really measuring anxiety more than it's measuring truth or falsehood, which is why it's not really acceptable scientifically. So much so, I mean, in this country, it's not acceptable at all. There is no police organization that would use any form of polygraph. In the US, there's still this idea that it might somehow have some value, which I don't think is so. That's my perspective on it. Also worth saying that, of course, Hubbard, despite claims made by Scientology, in at least 2 places, called the emeter a lie detector.
Correct. Yeah. In 1906, Jung published this work called Studies in Word Analysis, and he was actually using electrodes. He was using an emeter, though he called it a galvanometer, and the components were just not that good. But he was exploring the unconscious and other things. The jump to lie detection, jumping ahead of things. In America, I'm working a case right now. For your listeners, I'm a private investigator. Not everyone knows that. I am a licensed private investigator in the state of California. And I'm working on a case as a journalist, not as an investigator. What's interesting in America, some states will allow polygraphs to be introduced in court, but not all states.
Yeah.
It's a very controversial thing. But what's interesting is the polygraph in America can be used for pre-employment screening for military, defense, armored car drivers, but not everywhere. There's actually a law in America for employee protection against polygraph examinations. However, certain classes, military, defense, you will take a pre-employment polygraph screening. And I had one when I was a defense worker at Hughes Aircraft. I did take a polygraph. They're very stressful. I covered on my blog, I have a brand new blog called dirtycopsandpis.com. And I'm covering a celebrity polygrapher named Dan Rubikoff, who appears on a NBC Universal syndicated show called The Steve Wilkos Show. And the premise of this show is that you bring on two people, one's cheating on the other, and then Rubikoff polygraphs them and comes out and talks to Steve Wilkos, who used to be Jerry Springer's director of security. And it's a Jerry Springer-like zoo show. Yeah. And you'll say, you're lying, the polygraph shows you were cheating, and the audience will jeer and boo, the bad guy. But what's emerged in an unrelated case to the Wilkos show altogether, nothing to do with the show, Rubikoff has been accused in a lawsuit. Jonathan Carter, a Black officer of the New York Police Department, he applied to transfer the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, and he had to take a polygraph. Now, he was failed on the polygraph. He's alleging racial discrimination because there were text messages discovered, they've surfaced, and they've been verified by Peter Cresco, Mr. Carter's attorney, and the New York Daily News, that Dan Rubikoff was sending racist text messages. And he was failing a Black candidate. So this is important. The operator of a lie detector or an emeter can bias the test with their own personal biases.
Of course.
If they're a racist, or if they think you're a criminal, or if they want a conviction. So the operator is one of the major weak links in the system.
Yeah.
Their ideological bent of mind, their prejudices and biases. So that's when we're going to get into that. So lie detection became a thing, and it was interesting. The magazines at the time, you've seen the old things online where you can build what they were then calling, so the galvanometer, which measured electricity in the lab, became the psychogalvanometer. Yeah, that's what it became. So they wed the word psycho to galvanometer to have the psychogalvanometer, call for short lie detector. And they wanted to make it more accurate, so they would put a band on your chest to check your breathing. They can do voice stress. And even more modern lie detectors, interesting. If you can Google how to defeat a lie detector. And one of them, I learned this from the Steve Wilkos show, oddly enough. They put a pad on the chair on which you're sitting. And on Google, it tells you that if you squeeze your butt cheeks together, squeeze, it'll defeat the polygraph. But by setting you on this chair, they can get the muscular movements if you're trying to defeat the polygraph. So it's a cat and mouse game where polygraphers are trying to defeat countermeasures.
I remember, as a fairly true believer in Scientology, shortly after I left, I interviewed the wonderful Neville Chamberlain. I mean, I don't know what his parents were thinking calling him Neville. They obviously didn't like him from the start. But Nev was 16 when he joined the original C project, the C organization. And he's a much larger than life character, a great fun to sit around and chat with. And he told me something that I found really shocking.
What was that?
Because I was a believer. And he said, oh, confessionals, no problem. Look at the wall and think of a flower. And that was his way of defeating the e-meeting. Like, and you probably can. I'm such an innocent, I'm such a naive. I wanted the e-meter to work. I didn't want to be tricking anybody. I wanted to get case gain, by revealing things, but Nev had a different perception to mine.
It's funny, whenever you mention Neville Chamberlain, I always think of the British Prime Minister who met Hitler and said, well, peace in our time.
And the Prime Minister who, because of whom Hitler was defeated, but that's not the popular opinion. But had it not been for Chamberlain, there wouldn't have been a chance. His name is mud in this country. So you're having a kid and your surname is Chamberlain, and you go, what should we call him? I know, we'll call him Neville. No. What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? It'd be like if your last name were Gotti and you named your son John Gotti. Well, that's a good name. No, that'd be okay. So one thing they did do in World War II, they had to have a way of processing people's aptitudes for different jobs quickly. In the Allied military. So let's say if I were drafted and you were drafted, they had to have a way of measuring our intelligence. And this figures into Scientology later, this idea of measuring things, aptitude tests.
And old-fashioned IQ tests like the Otis.
Yeah, they did. They called it psychometry. And psychometry was also 19th century innovation. Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, is considered the father of psychometrics. Now, this didn't use a measure.
And eugenics, of course,
Yes, eugenics, that thing.
Speaking of racial biases.
Psychometrics was a way to, how do we measure the human psyche, its potentials, talents, flaws, and things that didn't really use a meter. But Hubbard would later use psychometrics. So that became interesting as well. So there's all these ways of, you can electrically measure human consciousness, whatever it is altogether, persons, potentials, personalities. So there was a parallel movement of measuring IQ, which is itself is a construct.
Absolutely, yeah. And Binet, who invented it, said this can only be used to measure one person's progress, not to measure any two people against each other.
Yeah.
And Otis, of course, designed the Army Alpha, so that the idea that this 1917 IQ test is the one, the revision of which is what's used in Scientology, that they're using something that antique. And that was where all military personnel were tested, and determination, all sorts of racist determinations were made. So, for example, the best immigrants you could have would be the British. After that, the Scandinavians. And down at the bottom of the heap were the Poles and the Jews, because these tests had showed that they were inferior. When Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard professor, used an Army Alpha on his postgraduate Harvard students, they were all morons because they didn't recognize the things in the test, like the wind-up gramophone. The reason the Poles and the Jews probably scored so badly was that they didn't speak English. And that meant that the Jewish immigration to the US was restricted, so that, in fact, tens of thousands of Jews could have been saved from the European Holocaust, but America wouldn't have them because of this metric, because of this completely erroneous and foolish metric. But
it is interesting how bias in measurement. There's a story out, I believe it's the state of Tennessee, when police officers, white police officers, were pulling over Hispanics, American Hispanics. They would mark them down on the ticket as white. The choice is white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, etc. In order to, and there was an article today called, "If everyone is white, there can be no racism." So in order to avoid charges of racial profiling of Hispanic motorists, they were marking Hispanics as white.
Yeah.
And that's a complete lie and dishonesty. So you can see the ground is fertile for fraud in terms of the government, in terms of racism. and all kinds of things. And this will play into Scientology as we get to it. Now, so we have the lie detector established. We have psychometrics, the art of measurement. And look, I'll say this about tests in World War II. You had some fairly advanced weapon systems. Yeah. So you needed people who had mathematical and engineering abilities to operate B-29s, B-17s, work on them. You had to have mechanical aptitude to work on a B-29 engine, a 32-cylinder Wasp twin radial, and radio. So there was a legitimate goal to get people who were technically qualified to operate advanced weapon systems. You obviously couldn't have someone with a 10th grade education operating a radar for night bombing on a B-29 over Japan. Okay. On the other hand, yes, they were used racially to keep Jews out, Poles, blacks, right? So that's part of the problem of racism in science, and the operator himself or herself. You have to have someone interpret the results. And this is quite unlike medicine. When I go in, I just went in for my complete physical. I'm 64 years old. And I had my stress EKG, my blood work, and that's all scientific. Yeah. Bad news for Scientology. I am as healthy as a goddamn horse.
Darn.
I am. I have longevity in my family. My grandma went to 97. Yeah. So this does not bode well for Scientology because I'm very healthy.
You'll be around for longer than they are.
Long. My cholesterol is low. Well, I take care of myself. Karen takes good care of me. Workout, exercise, hair dye, and yoga will get you a long way in this life. Plus, anyway, so I digress. So, but when the doctor, she looked at my EKG and she said, "That's outstanding. That's outstanding for a man of your age." Which I didn't like hearing, a man of
your age.
John, what alarmed me is I only have one box left to check. Here's a funny digression. When you fill out forms for life insurance or banking, whatever, you fill out all these forms through your whole life, right? And you have to check age group box, 18 to 25, 25 to 30, and so on. So I checked I'm in that box 60 to 64. And now at 65, that's the last box checked. After 65, they don't care because you're over 65, you're old. There's no more boxes to check, so what do? It's like, I only, like when I turn 65, it's like, there's no more boxes left to check. I'm old, but it is a state of mind. Anyway, I digress.
So it's also fair to say that of the 7 stages of man, it's only the 6th. There is another one.
What is that one?
Shakespeare gives us 7 stages of development, and the last one is probably 80 onward. So it's really unfair. I've passed 65 now, so what am I going to do?
It's ageism.
It's ageism, yeah.
It's ageism.
Stop it.
And I very much subscribe. Call me cynical. I may be attacked for this, but I very much believe in the axiom that old age and treachery will defeat youth and beauty every time. Anyway, that's just me. I'm cynical. Okay, so what happens is we fast forward through the war, and in 43, mid-war, just let me stop here. There's a test called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. And this is considered the creme de la creme of the test. The MMPI was so secret. And the Navy used it as a part of screening for psychopathology. It was considered the most advanced test. You can see it online. My suspicion, John, tell me if this is a good theory, you think. The MMPI was very secretive, and it was considered the deluxe best test for screening for mental health and other clinical issues. And you had to be trained as a psychologist to administer it. And a psychologist would look at it, right?
Yeah.
I think that while L. Ron Hubbard was malingering at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital for that year, he got his hands on the MMPI because it is a psychometric test, right? I think he read it. I think he read obviously Freud, Jung, and all the Sargent, all the people when he spent in the medical.
He kind of dipped into them. I don't think Hubbard seriously studied anything. I think the book that he read in Oak, or the papers that he read in Oak Knoll that are significant are Grinker and Spiegel's work, which would later be the book Men Under Stress, where they describe Dianetic abreaction, which of course Joseph Breuer had pretty much started with. Freud had dismissed it before the First World War, saying it just makes people more dependent. It doesn't actually resolve the transference, as he put it. So I will give him a point for spotting that.
Okay.
But Grinker and Spiegel were working out of North Africa, and they were working with pilots who had been, had to bail out and had maybe had quite serious burns, and they were getting them to abreact, to relive their experiences. The interesting thing is they were using the barbiturate drug phenobarbital to do this. And we know from Hubbard's own admissions, he says in a lecture that's been published, that he made himself a guinea pig in an experiment to come off phenobarbital. So he admitted the use of this. In 1965, he tried to cash a prescription in East Grinstead as Dr. L. Ron Hubbard for Nembutal, which is the UK name for it. The interesting thing is that while he was at Oak Knoll Hospital, he was being given this barbiturate because, although it was they never actually found an ulcer crater, but they said, well, he's probably got ulcers. The X-rays didn't show anything. So how much was just pure malingering, we don't know. But the treatment at that time for ulcers was to give you a hypnotic drug, barbiturates. So he's taking phenobarbital, and these guys are saying, use phenobarbital, and that will assist. It's kind of like sodium pentothal. It's like a truth drug. And so Hubbard was actually doing this. And I think he was sneaking in there. And as you say, he was trying to find something out. His 1947 letter to the Veterans Administration, where he begs for psychiatric treatment because he's in such a mess. I think his whole life was trying to resolve what he knew to be dreadful problems with him psychiatrically.
Yeah, I've had the theory, and when I was writing on Xenu.net around 2005, I started. One of the most controversial threads there I posted was L. Ron Hubbard sexually molested as a child? And I believe he was. And part of that has to do with Commander Thompson. I think it almost sounds like Commander Thompson was grooming him. I advanced this as a theory to talk about. He's in the Marines when he's in college, and he is booted out. He's released from the Marines. He's discharged on the condition that he may never re-enter. What happened in the Marines? Was he sexually molested as a child? We don't know what happened. And I think he was trying to resolve severe intrapsychic. Something happened to him.
I don't. And it's something I've considered also over the years in some detail. Firstly, I'm only aware of him spending 3 days with Thompson. That's on the boat through the Panama Canal. Mm-hmm. It's a very short period of time. I'm not aware of any allegations against Thompson as a pedophile. And from what I see with Hubbard, his childhood is immensely happy. That his aunts, his grandfather Leif, he is treated as a little king. When his mum washes his mouth out with soap, her sisters grab her and wash her mouth out with soap. He is highly protected, but he has trouble making friends. He was very spotty. He was overweight. As one of his school friends that we interviewed said, he was terrified of horses, which is difficult as his grandfather was keeping horses and was a veterinarian by trade. But I found no evidence that would point towards sexual abuse. What we do have, and this came up at Toronto when Gerry Armstrong was talking. Gerry started talking about Johnny Goodbugger, this pet name that he and Omar Garrison had for Hubbard. Johnny Goodbugger.
What was Johnny Goodbugger?
Goodbugger.
Okay.
And this is the lead character in Battlefield Earth, translated into L. Ron Hubbard. And the reason he asked him, why are you saying that? And he said, oh, we had letters from him in his teens talking about how much he liked buggering other boys. So you have, I think he was a sexual abuser. I don't see.
Well, now this is really interesting. So you're saying that Hubbard wrote letters how he liked buggering other boys?
Yeah, when he was a teenager.
Okay, well, this is interesting because here's this, and this goes to his. He writes that he traveled China with a British officer, who was in when he was 16
in Peking. Yeah,
he traveled in the company of a British officer, so he's around a man in a uniform.
Yep,
and in his writings, he's never, as a teenager, he's always with older men in uniforms,
including his father, of course.
Well, this is interesting because he says that he traveled with this British officer, and the time is he's 16, so he's on one of his travels to see his father overseas, right?
Yeah, it's for a few days. He talks about, is it Bubbling Wells Road or something? We have all of the diaries because Scientology put them into the Armstrong case, so I have them.
Okay, but then let me ask you this, because veering off topic, which we're allowed to do, he writes in his affirmations that he will be returned to the same level of sexual excitement he had when he was age 16. Correct?
Yep.
And he was in the company of an older military man when he was age 16. You never hear him talking about
for a few days, Jeff.
Well, still, I mean, you can have a little fling in a few days.
You can, but there's no sense of that in the diaries.
But he never talks about girlfriends. He never talks about girlfriends when he was a young man.
He talks about it later on, but yeah, that he doesn't talk about relationships, except, and I haven't seen these letters, but if Gerry says it, then I'm pretty sure it's true. He's always been accurate. That he is talking about him being the top rather than the bottom, him being the one in charge of a relationship with other boys.
Okay.
But
that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but that does go to his, if he were sexually active with boys, as you say, and in his affirmations later, he wants to be returned to that same stage of sexual excitement when he was 16, then that would have been in a homoerotic context. Yeah. And we do see the homoeroticism come out in Mission Earth series.
Yes. And how degraded novels, as he says in Keeping Scientology Working. My God, it's worse than William Burroughs, that stuff.
Well, there's a scene that that I've shared about on the Underground Bunker and in my work in Mission Earth, I think it's volume 9, where the nurse has a line of young boys lined up, and she has to give them oral sex to cool them down. That's his Hubbard writing. He's at his Creston Ranch, wanted for income tax evasion and services.
300 writs out on him by that time, yeah.
Well, he's hiding out at the ranch writing homoerotic porn, and he's talking about these boys were so foamy you couldn't help but swallowing. He's getting very specific about ejaculate. And this is a guy who's discovered the reactive mind and the 75 million year trap. So there is something there. We've digressed off that.
There's certainly something. I mean, he was sexually abusive towards his first wife. She wrote about that. He was sexually abusive towards Sarah, his second wife. She said she had a ruptured eustachian tube from him hitting her. I differ from many historians of this subject. I believe that the work of Nibs Hubbard is vital to an understanding of his father. Almost everybody else just dismisses it and says, well, he signed things saying he committed perjury. Looking at his final manuscript, The Telling of Me by Me, which sadly still hasn't been published, but I have a copy of it. He there talks about his father liking to take one of the Scientology groupies and give her a cocktail of contraindicated drugs. So you give them amphetamines and barbiturates, uppers and downers, and you cause unconsciousness. And then when the woman was unconscious, he would strip her down and cut her with a razor blade. I'm kind of going, this sounds a bit too weird, but well, I'm going to tell a nib story. This is a digression. Why not? In 1985, a friend of mine went to do Nibs's upper levels course. Nibs was back in the game again, and partly because of me, because I'd started interviewing him via an intermediary in 84, and he put a tape out and back he came. And for $500, you could go to, I think it was Carson City he was living in, and in Nevada, and he would personally give you this course. And a friend of mine went, and she wrote me this letter saying that she'd had sex with the Holy Spirit. I found this a little bit worrying, I must say. Then an Australian, Roland Barclay, I think his name was, he went out there and did the course. But when Nibs gave him the Tibetan herbs that he was meant to take before the session, he pocketed the pill. And when he had the pill tested, it proved to be MDMA, ecstasy.
Wow.
So Nibs, in The Telling of Me, talks about the ability to talk a woman into orgasm. He's saying his dad taught him this trick. And you give them, and he describes a particular session where he did it. You give a woman contraindicated drugs, and you can then talk her up through this thing. So his father, I believe that what he says is true. His father was a sexual sadist. He was predatory. He tortured women. Both of his first two wives both talked about being tortured by him. And he taught his son to do certain other things. So he was then what appears to have happened somewhere in the mid-60s is he became impotent. And when I talked with John McMaster, the world's first real clear, from 1965, John told me that wherever he went in the world, he found little red-headed children, among the followers. So it would appear that he was highly sexually active. And then sometime in the mid-60s, I believe he became impotent. And everything then went into the Z organization and controlling and dominating people in this very new way, throwing them overboard, putting them in uniforms, all of this dreadful stuff that he did then. And his sexual drive, as he put it, was sublimated. And thankfully, Viagra hadn't been invented then.
Yeah, I agree with you. I as a researcher, I'm and a historian, not of your caliber, certainly. I give L. Ron Hubbard Jr.'s works quite a bit of credibility. I especially his penthouse interview, where his father talks about the acquisition of power.
Yes.
And to me, that resonates. And I tend to, I believe L. Ron Hubbard Jr. really told the truth about things.
Yeah.
And that the fact that the church, he was financially strapped and the church made him sign recantations. Well, L. Ron Hubbard clearly, he could, when he was married to Sarah Northrup, he made her sign a recantation. Yeah. And that's just part of the Scientology's culture. You have to sign these recantations that you lied. But that's so they don't destroy you.
Yeah, they say Vicky Asneram, when she left, she made various affidavits and then she had to withdraw them all. And I must say that's the only thing that they found in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky that they could refute. And I've left them in there because I believe she was telling the truth. And then she lied. With Nibs, there's a differentiation. If he's talking about his own experience, I believe he is generally truthful. Yes. If he is reporting what his father told him, and it gets pretty scary that he believed his father really was the Antichrist, really was Satan on earth. Those are ideas that have come from his father, and those are not trustworthy. So when he says, for example, that his father got the magic from the same person who gave it to Hitler, I firstly don't believe anybody gave the magic to Hitler, maybe Himmler or Hess, but certainly not Hitler, who seemed to be fairly anti-magic. And I don't believe that whoever gave, the Germanen Orden or the Tool group or whichever group, there is no connection. What there is, however, a connection in that Hubbard thought in the same way that the Nazis did, that kind of magical world. And I think he moved in and out of that. I think it was almost a psychotic belief in magic. And there's no evidence ever of him performing any supernatural feat, despite the fact he was selling supernatural powers. But I've not even heard of a story where Hubbard claims any such powers, which is fascinating. Most gurus will say, I float in the air, or I do this, or I do that. Hubbard pushed other people out to the front, and so people like Otto Rose and John McMaster were put forward as examples. And having interviewed both of them, neither of them ever had a supernatural experience either. But
yeah, Hubbard moved between the worlds of the occult and the psychological.
Yeah,
and he blurred a lot of them. Well, going back on track, and I found a newspaper clipping from 1951. So let's go back into Dianetics.
Let's do that.
And so whatever went on between 45 and 1950, to me, is a fascinating part of Hubbard's life that's really not been explored.
Yeah, from Oak Knoll through Jack Parsons.
Yeah, the occult and the psychological are fused.
And of course, where he first mentions what will be Dianetics in January 49 in a letter from Savannah, Georgia, where he's staying with Burks, A.J. Burks, who is also a vital part of this story, understanding what Burks was thinking and teaching and knowing how closely Hubbard was connected. But you have the letter which Tony Ortega published. And it's this terrible thing. People keep finding something and putting it out there. I'm going, oh yeah, I'm sorry, that's been in my collection for years. But this letter from Savannah, Georgia, which was written to Forry Ackerman, his literary agent, where he says that using these techniques, you can rape women and they won't know about it. You can make lots of money. He doesn't say anything about helping people using Dianetics. It's all about control and money.
Yeah, he gave himself away in that time. In January 1951, going back onto track, there's an article where he publishes it in Bridgewater, New Jersey paper, saying that Thomas H. Leggett has passed the required psychometric and physical tests of the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation. So he starts using, not the meter yet, we don't even get to the e-meter, he's using psychometric tests, aptitude, intelligence. To be a Dianeticist, you had to have psychometric tests. So he's using psychometry, and I'm going to come back to that. And basically what happens is he was putting people into a Dianetics reverie, hypnotism.
A light trance, yeah.
Yeah, light trance. So he's not still at the e-meter. And really what's interesting to me is there is a California inventor and chiropractor named Volney Matthison. And he lived from 1897 to 1965. He also went by the name of Dex Volney. Volney is the inventor of he's the inventor of the e-meter. What Volney Mathison's interest was, up until Volney, it was a psychogalvanometer. It was always called psychogalvanometer. Volney Matthison had the marketing genius to call it an electropsychometer. And so my question in my research was, when did Volney Matthison meet L. Ron Hubbard? And Volney Matthison mentions that he went to an L. Ron Hubbard lecture in 1950 in Los Angeles. So this is where we can link Hubbard meeting the e-meter. It was Volney's e-meter, electropsychometer, and Hubbard meets it in 1950.
It would have been about the fall of 1950 when he's in Los Angeles.
Yeah, because he's putting out newspaper ads. And just as an aside, this independent scholar, Ian Camacho, when Hubbard announces the world's first clear,
Sonia.
Yes, Sonia Bianca. Camacho says a lack of contemporary newspaper coverage is an argument that it didn't happen, but Hubbard was advertising in newspapers. The movement was only 6 months old. The LA Times was not going to send a reporter. Nobody knew about clear. It wasn't a big thing.
Camacho works out of motivated reasoning, and my last communication to him, and I tried to be friendly, was exactly that he is seeking to prove something. And if you are to investigate something properly, while you might have hypotheses that you want to check, you don't cram the facts into them. I must say my connection with him was very disappointing because he really didn't have answers to questions. And the amount of time we took because of his paper on, when Hubbard says he was a CE, he never said it was a civil engineer. We ended up, just one thing after another, I found a press release where he said that he CE meant.
It's in books. I could go grab a book.
Well, eventually what we got that doesn't seem to have satisfied Camacho is a handwritten letter from Hubbard saying that the who's who in the South and Southwest is reasonably accurate. And he came back at me on the word reasonably. He said, he doesn't say it's accurate. That entry says that he has a BS, not a BSc, a BS in Civ Engring. And so it's as close as we can get. As to the fake PhD having bought Sequoia University before awarding himself a PhD, that's another matter altogether. What a con artist.
Well,
flim flam.
So Dianetics becomes a runaway bestseller. Hubbard's lecturing. Volney Matthison meets him. Volney had developed, as you'll see in my history of the emeter, if you look at it, he had developed the electropsychometric tone scale. He had developed a book of emeter drills. So Volney, somewhat like Ada Rolf, believed as a chiropractor that if he could get to the underlying psychic distress, it would help chiropractic.
Yeah.
Because he discovered when he massaged patients, like Ada Rolf did, that memories would often submerge, and then he bought the theory that painful traumas are stored in the body, like the body's capacitor. So basically, what's happening is a couple things. The Dianetics Foundation is going bankrupt. Hubbard is overspent, overextended. The movement crashed. What's interesting, I don't know, first year copy, Dianetics sold over 50,000 copies. I have the numbers somewhere here. But his second book, Science of Survival, sells 900 maybe.
I was told that Hermitage House recorded 150,000 sales for Dianetics before Art Sepos withdrew it. And the information may not be right. Art Sepos withdrew it on the grounds that it was fraudulent.
Yeah.
Then hired Dr. Joe Winter, who, of course, lived and worked with Hubbard in the development of to write the doctor's report on Dianetics to expose Hubbard as a fraud while still saying there may be some value in this technique.
I don't know how you do that, but my point was Volney Matthison was doing creative image therapy. So he had basically what I would call pre-Scientology. He just didn't have the language. So a couple of things happened real quick. Hubbard is going bankrupt. He, right as the Dianetics Foundation is collapsing, he's in Wichita, and Don Purcell supporting him, he copyrights the word Scientology. He has Volney's emeter. He gives a demonstration of it in Wichita the night before. I think he and Susie, his wife, Mary Sue, depart for Phoenix.
Yep.
So he lets Don Purcell. Basically, he resigns from Dianetics Foundation. Purcell puts it into bankruptcy, has all the debt and all the problems. Hubbard has this new thing called Scientology with an emeter and heads to Phoenix.
And of course, he's lost all the rights to Dianetics. He's assigned everything to over to Don Purcell.
Yeah, Don Purcell.
And with the thought that everything is going to go really pear-shaped. And what happens is I think that Purcell buys everything back from the bankruptcy court for $800. And Hubbard has sold it all to him from $1. And he was trying to protect Hubbard even before he'd left for Phoenix. And there are only a few weeks before that happens. He's already had his business manager, James Elliott, who's listed on his letterhead as his business manager, go and steal the mailing lists from the Wichita Foundation. And 31 letters are sent, and I do have them. 31 letters are sent out by Hubbard attacking Purcell. Well, Purcell is desperately trying to protect Hubbard and the material. This would be such a typical Hubbard overreaction, just as it would be with, destroying the mission system in 1982-83, because he gets paranoid. And Purcell would have, he kept writing for the Aberree well into the late 1950s, Purcell, as to how much he wanted to help Hubbard, and Hubbard was, paranoid. What can we say?
Sure. But you can see that Hubbard has, Volney Matthison has something that's very valuable, but he doesn't see in it what Hubbard sees it. So here's a couple points. Although and this is how I see it.
Yeah.
Dianetics was Hubbard's down payment on Scientology, but he didn't know it at the time. Here's maybe we can leave this as part one and pick up part two, because there's a lot more. Here's what I'll leave it at. Hubbard realized something about the emeter that Volney Matthison didn't. That he could audit people. That he could leave Dianetics to crater, but he had the Dianetics model of engrams, but he could suddenly read engrams, not old Dianetics was talking therapy, coffee shop auditing, you ask questions. There was no meter in Dianetics, early Dianetics. Hubbard realized that if he could put someone on a meter holding the cans and use a meter, he suddenly had Scientology. And he could say that Dianetics dealt with the mind, Scientology deals with the spirit. So really the key thing I want to leave here for part one, because there's so much more, is Hubbard was able to flee the train wreck that was Dianetics. Leave Don Purcell with all the debt and all the problems. Take the model of engrams and the reactive mind, and then measure those on an e-meter. And that was his genius. That was his genius, and that's what allowed him to reboot himself and reinvent himself as the founder of Scientology. So I would leave it at that. And there's a really interesting thing that I'll leave for the next part, but I'll just give you, the listeners, a taste of it. Here's the real secret of Scientology's e-meter. It's agnostic. It's agnostic. It's content independent. It doesn't care what frame of reference it's used in. I could put it, like I said earlier, I could put a Christian, a Jew, an atheist, member of Latter-day Saints, anyone on a meter, and they would.
Richard Dawkins.
I could put Richard Dawkins on and say, do you believe in atheism?
Of haunted houses, and apparently he is.
Well, the point is, look. Everyone has galvanic skin resistance, so the e-meter will read anything. I could put a Christian on it and say, do you believe you're saved by the blood of Jesus Christ? And it would read as a truthful statement. But it's sort of like so it's agnostic. It doesn't care what it's reading. It doesn't care what frame of reference it's used in. And the reason the public was open to accept it, by that time, people had cars. So they had meters in their cars for speed, gas, oil pressure, water temperature. So they were used to the idea that things were read on meters. So the public was predisposed to do this. Hubbard knew this. Hubbard realized that he could weld this agnostic device to his Dianetic system. And if you believed in Dianetics and engrams and the reactive mind, it would read on the meter. And therefore, Hubbard created the principle that if it reads on the meter, it must be true. Therefore,
there is the dread secret. If it reads on the meter, it must be true.
So past lives, engrams, implanting stations, later body thetans, overts, withholds, crimes. If it reads on the meter, and that's what led Hubbard to say the e-meter knows all and sees all. Well, no, what's happening is you're operating within a paradigm or a construct called Scientology. And if you accept those principles, they will read on the emeter. But like I said, equally, I could take a member of the Latter-day Saints and ask, do you believe that Joseph Smith really found the golden plates that were given to him by the angel Moroni? Yes, that would come as a truthful statement.
Yeah. So
Galvani skin resistance, on the one hand, is a demonstration or only a validation of the person's subjectively held beliefs. It will confirm that, yes, they sincerely believe these subjectively held content, even if they're fantastical or not true or mythological. It also confirmed the fact if you were bitten by a bear, let's say you were attacked by a bear, that would read on the meter as well. The meter cannot discriminate objective from subjective content. It can operate in any frame of reference. And I want to leave that and go into how Hubbard used that. And that's the concealed part of Scientology. We'll get into the secret of what he really did with it and why he jumped from engrams to body thetans in part 2.
Okay, let me round off part 1.
Please.
Just a point about the quality of the emeter. I had a good friend called Barry Pemberthy, and Barry used to mend emeters at St. Hill in England. And he and the guy he was working with on this were surprised at the poor quality of the materials used in the then Mark V emeter. For example, he said with some horror that it had a germanium transistor in it. Meant nothing to me, but it sounded like a pretty dreadful, cheap thing. So what he and his friend did, and he always gave more credit to his friend than to himself. I don't remember his friend's name, never met him. They decided they would get the most expensive materials possible and build an emeter. And they built what he would later call the ability meter. And they put a Mark V emeter and their new meter. So for example, just the jewel on which the needle pivots in their machine cost more than all of the components of a Mark V emeter. They used the best. And they figured, this will be a much better machine. They went down the pub while they left these 2 meters with the same impulse being put into both of them and a bar chart recorder. And when they got back, they found out that the Mark V emeter had twice as many readings as the ability meter. So they thought, oh, we've done something wrong. So the next time they didn't go to the pub and they watched, and to their horror found that half of the readings on the Mark V were internally generated. So on top of the fact that it's only reading subjective responses, you get this reaction. Now, the particular one that became famous is the rock slam, this incredible, jagged, erratic thrashing about of the needle. And when Otto Roos was asked to audit L. Ron Hubbard, who was having his usual seasonal bronchitis from smoking 100 cigarettes a day, not actually the attack of the body thetans, but 100 cigarettes a day, chain smoke one after the other. So every winter he'd get bronchitis. That's how the clearing course came about, 65, winter of 65, 66. That's how OT3 came about, winter of 66, 67. That's how new era Dianetics for operating thetans, the 5th OT level, David Mayo is auditing him through this. We had another bout, I think it would have been 71. And Otto, as the only OT8 up to that time, and for some years later, as one of only 5 class 12s trained by Hubbard, is called in to go through everything. And Otto told me that he found envelopes, scraps of paper, beer mats, all sorts of things that Hubbard had collected, recording his own auditing. And as he looked through these things, he found in excess of 200 rock slams, because during the 60s, the rock slam was reckoned to be finding this basic incident called the rock, which is long gone. And so he'd been tracking this thing and he got a couple of hundred. But by this time, Hubbard had said, rock slams indicate evil purposes. And indeed, when the Flag Land Base was founded in 74, 75 in Florida, there was a period when a huge amount of the crew were put into the gulag the labor force, the rehabilitation project force, because they'd had a single rock slam in their auditing. Now, we roll up to the late 70s. Now, I happen to have noticed that emeters rock slam when the electrodes are not plugged in. I've seen that. And so I was a bit skeptical about what's going on. Then suddenly we get this process called silver sealing. You have to pay every year to have your emeter brought up to scratch. What they're actually doing is getting you to pay to replace the carbon potentiometer, which is the tone arm, the volume control, if you like, in simple terms, because it's actually, whenever you move it, carbon dust is coming off it. And that dust is inside the circuitry of the machine, and it's causing rock slams. So when we get into how scientific the emeter is, you have to have an instrument that actually works. I interviewed a member of the Watchdog Committee who was on the Watchdog Committee in 81. And they'd gone to Texas Instruments to ask them how much it would cost to make the Mark VI emeter. And I think it was $38. The total production cost with the profit for Texas Instruments for the meter that was sold for then $2,000, I think it was then $1,500, $2,000, was $38. So you're dealing with a very low precision version of the Wheatstone bridge before you go any further with this. So, let's hope that stimulates our audience's appetite for.
Yeah, in part two, I'm going to show some emeters on screen and talk about hardware. I spent 30 years as a sales engineer. I dealt with problems like optical noise in a laser.
Yeah.
And I know about hardware, and I do want to talk about bill of materials, patents, and a lot of the other things that went on, and get into the institutional. In the meantime, until our part two, the homework will be for readers. Oh, you can't see the book. I have the book introducing the emeter from the lectures and demonstrations of L. Ron Hubbard. So there was quite a few, even the way he rolled out the book and told people how to use it is part of the indoctrination process. It's just like a bad polygrapher who's a racist. If he instructs other people if he introduces racial bias into how to use a polygraph, you have an inherently flawed thing. And by analogy to what Dan Rubikoff has allegedly done, L. Ron Hubbard did the same thing. He introduced his cultic system of interrogation and paranoia and into how to use the emeter. Yeah. So within Scientology, this agnostic device, this detects galvanic skin resistance, became a weapon, a tool. And that's what I want to talk about in part two. We also talk about, like I said, hardware and patents. So look forward to it.
Fantastic. And I've been studying this subject for far too long. But you said things in this interview that I did not know. And I think providing such a thorough grounding is really important, to the understanding. We have to look at this thing objectively. We have to look at the evidence rather than sort of believing anything that L. Ron Hubbard ever said, because he did say honesty is sanity. And it's one of the quotations I give from Hubbard frequently, because he was quite evidently an incredibly dishonest human being, which you can see from his contradictions about his own history, that he tells one story and then tells another story that is in conflict with it, particularly, say, his war history, where in November 1950, I looked it up again the other day, I thought it was December, November 1950, Look magazine, he says that at the end of the war, he had ulcers, conjunctivitis, pink eye, he'd had a fall down a ship's ladder, and he had something wrong with his feet. By 1965, in my philosophy, he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II. So 15 years have changed his story somewhat significantly.
Yes, and his family was going to abandon him as a hopeless cripple.
Abandoned by family and friends.
Oh,
Faced a non-existent future. What a lying bastard he was. But there you go. Okay, Jeff. Fantastic.
Okay, John.
We'll, finish this one off and regroup again soon.
Yeah, look forward to part two.
Great. So, Jeff Augustine, fantastic, brilliant.
Likewise.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like as well as subscribe and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.